Hello class, we move on to chapter 5 of the textbook. Chapter 5 discusses the overview and introduction of the national economy, which is macroeconomics. Here is the order of video clips. 1. Production possibility frontier, macro applications. 2. Circular flow model. 3. Hot topic of feminist GDP. 4. Underground economy.
The first question that any economic system must answer is this: what goods will be produced? That is, what combination of the possible goods and services will be produced in this economy? In order to summarize the possible combinations of goods and services that can be produced, the economist needs a tool, and the tool that we use is called the production possibilities frontier. Production possibilities, what it's possible to produce. The production possibilities frontier shows all combinations of goods and services that it's possible to produce in this economy given its resource endowment, that is the amount of capital, labor, and raw materials available, and given its technology, that is its know-how for transforming raw materials into final goods and services. The production possibilities frontier will show you the maximum amount of one good that the economy can produce, given the amount of other goods that it's already producing and given its resource and technological constraints. I'm going to draw now a production possibilities frontier for a sample economy. And because this is macroeconomics, instead of using two goods like apples and oranges, we're going to use aggregate goods, that is, goods that are actually a broad class of a type of good. The two types of goods that we'll use are consumption goods and investment goods. Let me first define. A consumption good is a good or service that provides immediate satisfaction for its own sake. For instance, an example of a consumption good is clothing, or food, or perhaps entertainment, or medical care, things that provide you with satisfaction right now. These are the consumption goods. And on the horizontal axis of my production possibilities graph, I'm going to measure the quantity of consumption goods that are produced in this economy. Now, you're asking, well, what is this? Is this shirts? Is this medical care? Is this food? What is it? Well, what it actually is an aggregate. We've made up some kind of measure of consumption goods in general. Think of this as the number of baskets of consumption goods. And in each basket, there's a little bit of food, a little bit of clothing, a little bit of medical care. And the numbers here on the horizontal axis represent the number of those baskets, an aggregate measure of consumer goods available in this economy. On the vertical axis, we're going to measure the quantity of investment goods. Investment goods are sometimes called capital or tools. These are goods that produce other goods. An example is a sewing machine. Another example might be a drill press. Another example might be a factory. Anything that actually is valuable because it produces other things is a capital good or a tool or an investment good. I'm going to use here the letter I to stand for investment goods. And something you'll learn very quickly in macroeconomics is that when we say investment, we're talking about the spending, the purchases of businesses. Investment is business spending. And on the vertical axis here, I've calibrated numbers that represent the overall quantity of investment goods produced in our economy. So once again, we're thinking of this as baskets, representative measures of tools. So there's a little bit of sewing machine, a little bit of drill press, a little bit of factory in each of these baskets. And we're going to produce 25, 50, 75, 100, or so forth. So on my two axes, I am measuring the quantities of things that are valuable in our economy. On the horizontal, we have consumption goods represented by the letter C, and on the vertical axis, we have investment goods or capital or tools represented by the letter I. Now, what are our production possibilities? That depends. It depends on the quantity of resources we have, land, labor, tools to use, and it depends also on our technology, our know-how, or our ability to translate these raw materials into final goods and services. I'm going to represent these possibilities first with a table of numbers. We can call this table the production possibilities schedule. As you look at these numbers, you'll see the maximum quantity of consumer goods that can be produced for any given quantity of investment goods produced. So for instance, whenever we're producing 100 bundles of investment goods, we're using up all of the resources in our economy, and we have nothing left to produce consumer goods with. We can take that piece of information and move over into our graph and find a point that shows us our output when we devote all of our resources to the production of investment goods. And that's this point right here, 100 bundles of investment goods and no consumer goods at all. That's a point then on the vertical axis. The next combination listed in the table has 75 investment goods and 100 consumer goods. Let's think about what this means. If we are willing to give up 25 bundles of investment goods, we will free up land, labor, and capital. We will free up resources that will allow us to produce 100 units of consumer goods. That is, these resources that were being used to produce tools have an opportunity cost. You can either have 25 extra tools or you can have 100 new consumer goods. The opportunity cost of this 100 units of consumer goods is the 25 tools that we must give up in order to produce them. We stop producing the tools, that frees resources that are then diverted into the production of consumer goods. And we can show that as this new point on the production possibilities frontier. The combination here is 75 tools and 100 bundles of consumer goods. Let's continue this line of thinking as we look at the next combination on the schedule, 50 units of investment good and 150 units of consumer goods. Now, the opportunity cost of getting an additional 50 units of consumer goods is 25 tools. Give up 25 tools, and now you can get an additional 50 units of consumer goods for a combination of 150 consumer goods and 50 investment goods. Well, notice what's happened here. The first 25 tools we were willing to do without bought us 100 consumer goods. The next time we give up 25 tools, we only get an additional output of 50 consumer goods. What's going on? Well, this is a matter of increasing opportunity cost. That is, the first time we cut back our production of sewing machines and other tools, we did so by freeing the resources that are best suited for the production of clothing. That is, we took the resources that could most easily be transformed into consumer goods and we let them go first as we reduced our output of tools. Now, if we want to reduce the output of tools further, we're taking resources that aren't quite as well suited for the production of consumer goods as the first set. So maybe the first time we let go of cloth, we let go of labor that was talented in the production of clothing, and we sent them over to produce consumer goods instead. Now we've got workers that know a lot more about tools and not quite as much about producing clothing. And whenever we move them from the tool sector into the consumption sector, they don't add as much additional output as the workers that we first transferred. So you can see we have an increasing opportunity cost because some resources are better suited to the production of tools and other resources are better suited to the production of consumer goods. Let's continue this logic by looking at the next point in the schedule, 25 units of tools and 170 units of consumer goods. Now, whenever we let go of another 25 units of tools, that is, whenever we cut back the production, our output of consumer goods only increases by 20 units. This is because the resources that are being freed are less well suited to the production of consumer goods than the resources that were freed in the earlier stages. And finally, whenever we reduce our output by that final 25 bundles of tools, that is, when we cut our investment output to zero, we increase our output of consumer goods only 10 more units, up to 180. This is the quantity of consumer goods that we can produce when all of the resources of our economy are diverted into the production of consumer goods. This last set of resources is quite well suited to the production of sewing machines and not very well suited to the production of clothing. That's why we got only a small increase in consumption for a relatively large reduction in investment. So here are 5 possible combinations of consumer and investment output. This is our production possibilities frontier. But of course you can imagine that we could produce lots of combinations in between. Instead of reducing output by 25 joules, we could reduce it by 10 or 5 or 1 or 0.5. Therefore, if we connect these dots, we get all the possible combinations of tools and consumer goods. That is, all the possible combinations of investment goods and consumption that are possible to produce in our economy given its resource endowment and its technology. So another way of thinking about this is, if we want to produce 80 units of clothing, that is 80 bundles of consumer goods, then given our resources and our technology, the most we can produce in investment goods is going to be, it looks like from this picture, about 80 units of investment goods. That is, go up to the production possibilities frontier and see the maximum quantity of investment that you can produce for a given quantity of consumption. Now, this production possibilities frontier tells us several things about economics. That is, we can see many of the basic concepts of economics in this picture. The first thing we can see is the reality of scarcity. That is, there are some combinations of investment and consumption that we'd like to have in our economy that simply aren't possible. For instance, 120 units of consumption good and 100 units of investment, that's a point up here that lies outside the production possibilities frontier. This would be a very nice point to achieve, but it's simply not achievable given the resources and the technology that our economy has to work with. So points outside the production possibility frontier indicate the reality of scarcity. Points inside the production possibility frontier, like this one, 40 units of consumption and 50 units of investment, represent the possibility of unemployment or underemployment. If we're not using all of our resources, or we're using them in uses for which they are not especially well suited, then we're not going to be producing the maximum amount of investment goods that can be produced for a given amount of consumption. So points within the production possibility frontier represent unemployment or underemployment. The downward slope of the production possibility frontier reminds us of opportunity cost. If you want more consumer goods, that is, if you want to move outward on the horizontal axis, you have to move downward on the vertical axis. To get more consumer goods, you have to give up investment goods. There is a trade-off. More of one good means necessarily less of another. And finally, notice that the curve gets steeper as we move down it. That's because the slope of the curve represents opportunity cost. Remember from slope, rise over run. In this case, the rise is the reduction in investment goods that's necessary to give you the run or the increase in consumer goods. 25 investment goods given up may buy you 100 consumer goods at one point on the curve, but only 10 consumer goods at another point on the curve. As the curve gets steeper, the opportunity cost of additional consumption is getting larger. That's because not all resources are equally well suited to the production of tools and consumer goods. Some resources are better at tools, and we keep them in the production of tools until the very end. Others are better suited for the production of consumer goods, and we move them into the consumer good production as quickly as possible as we start increasing output in that sector. So the bowed shape, the outward bowed shape of the production possibility frontier indicates increasing opportunity cost. Now, what happens if we change the things we held constant at the beginning of this story? When I drew this production possibility frontier, I held constant the resources of this economy and its technology. What happens if we change one or both of those factors? Well, when you draw this curve, remember, you're holding those things constant. You're saying what happens to our production of investment goods if we increase our production of consumer goods, ceteris paribus, that is, holding constant resources and technology. But if you're going to change resources and technology, that is, if you're going to change the original assumptions that were made when you drew the curve, you've got to draw the whole curve over again. When you change those basic assumptions, you've got to go back and redraw the relationship. So let's start with an example. Suppose we have an improvement in technology that allows us to produce a lot more tools for a given quantity of consumer goods. That is, suppose there is a technological change that allows us to make tools more simply. Maybe some advance in computer know-how or the discovery of a new mineral that's useful in making tools. And let's suppose that this technological advance applies to the production of tools, but not to the production of clothing. That is, if we use all of our resources in clothing, we can still produce the same quantity of clothing as before. But if we produce tools now, we're going to get more tools than before. That is, the production possibility frontier is going to lie outside the original. Our possibilities have increased, and these increased possibilities favor the production of tools. That is, with these new possibilities, you can make tools more easily than before. Notice the way the curve shifted. The shift is biased in the direction of tools. That's because this technological progress favored the production of tools. The same picture would apply if we got new resources that were useful in the production of investment goods, but not particularly useful in the production of consumer goods. Let's consider another case. What happens to this curve over time? Because, see, this is a dynamic story. If you make the decision to devote some of your society's resource to the production of tools, you're increasing your resource base. If you don't eat everything now and you plant some of it, you're going to be able to grow more food tomorrow. So whenever you make a choice to be at a point like this on the curve, a point that involves a balance between the production of goods for consumption today and goods that can be used as tools to make more goods tomorrow, then your production possibilities frontier is going to shift outwards over time. And we call this outward shift economic growth. That is, as you accumulate tools, you increase your ability to produce output in your economy. And this accumulation of tools advances the production possibilities. It means you can make more of everything over time. This is called economic growth. And we imagine that economic growth is probably no more likely to favor consumption as it is to favor investment. That is, the tools you make will help you make clothing as well as sewing machines tomorrow. So the whole curve shifts outwards. Some economic growth is biased in one direction or another, but in general, there's no reason to assume that the investment in tools doesn't increase your production possibilities broadly, that is, increase your ability to make output in both sectors in the next period. Suppose there is a war that affects this economy. How would the production possibilities change? Looking at the diagram, we can imagine that the output in both sectors would be reduced. That is, if war occupied or destroyed some of the resources in this economy, the quantity of consuming and investing goods that can be produced is going to be reduced. So the curve would shift inward like this. How would immigration affect the production possibilities frontier? Suppose talented labor were to find its way into this economy. What would happen? We can show that as an outward shift in the production possibilities frontier. The ability to produce more of all goods than before. What would happen now if a technological change occurred that increased the ability to produce consumption goods but didn't change the ability to produce investment goods? We would show that as a biased shift in the production possibility frontier that increased the possibilities only in one dimension. The production possibilities frontier, then, summarizes the capability of this economy to produce goods and services. And one interesting thing to notice is that it's possible to talk about the production possibilities frontier in terms of these aggregates. The trade-off between enjoying consumption today and using your resources to make tools so that you can enjoy even more consumption tomorrow. So I was just at the grocery store, and I got this dollar bill in change, and it says Lucy on it. And you have to wonder, where is Lucy now? And why did she write her name on this dollar bill? And you can't help but wonder where all this has been and how many people have touched it besides Lucy, who chose not to write their name on it. If you think about money, you start to be drawn into the way it circulates in our economy, that it's been in so many other people's hands, and the next time I spend it, it's going to go into someone else's hands who's going to wonder about Lucy. Every time you spend money, you are creating income for someone else. At the grocer just now, when I paid for my groceries, my spending became his income. Of course, some of it was his. Some of it went to pay for the food that he had stocked his shelf with. Some of it went to pay his workers, but some of it was his income. My spending became his income. And when you add up the aggregates in the economy, it must be true that in a given period of time, the total amount of spending is equal to the total amount of income. This is one of the most basic, fundamental concepts in macroeconomics. And to understand this concept better, we're going to build a circular flow diagram to show the way that money circulates through the economy, and the complementary circle, the circle of resources through the economy. Because money moves in one direction to pay for stuff, which is moving in the other direction. And you can see this more clearly when you put it all down at once in a picture. So let's build a circular flow diagram, and we'll start with households. Households' purchases of goods and services is called consumption, and the households purchase goods and services with money. They acquire the money by selling their resources, land, labor, capital. And they sell these resources in the market for factors, the factors of production, or the resource markets. The second set of players in our circular flow diagram are the firms or businesses. Firms or businesses hire the factors of production and transform this land, labor, and capital into the goods and services that households purchase. Firms pay for the factors of production with money. This money becomes the income of the households, which they then use to purchase the goods and services that the factories have made. We're going to look now at the interaction of households and firms in these two distinct markets. First, we'll look at the market for the factors of production. Households supply resources, and I'll use red to indicate the flow of resources. Land, labor, and capital flows into the factor markets from the households. Over in the factor markets, this land, labor, and capital is hired by firms who then put these resources to work producing goods and services. Now, the complementary flow to this flow of resources from households through the factor markets into firms is the flow of money. Businesses pay for these resources with money. And this payment takes the form of wages, interest payments, rental payments for property, and profits that are returned to households who own stock in the companies. So in the factor markets, we see resources flowing in one direction and money payments for the use of those resources flowing in the other direction. The other market in which firms and households interact is the market for goods and services. In this market, goods and services are provided by the firms and purchased and enjoyed by the households. So the resource flow in this direction is clockwise. The money flow is in the other direction. Households pay money for goods and services, and that money winds up as the revenue of businesses. And out of this revenue, businesses pay wages, interest, etc., over in the factor markets. You see now that we've got a complete circle. Money begins as the factories pay wages and interest payments to the households, their income, and this income then is used when the households buy goods and services in this market. Then it becomes the revenue of factories. So money flows around the circle counterclockwise. Resources flow the other direction. Households supply land, labor, and capital to businesses that transform them using their technology into goods and services that wind up back in the households. That's the circular flow. Resources in one direction, money in the other direction. And looking at this picture, it should be clear that spending and income are equal. They have to be, because this is a closed system. Now, we can add other players to our story and see how that complicates the circular flow. The first candidate for being added to the model is the government. And the government interacts in this circular flow in several directions. First of all, the government buys goods and services from the goods and service markets, and the government hires factors of production like land, labor, and capital in order to run the government, hires them from the resource markets. The government pays money to its employees and other people who sell it factors of production, and the government pays money for the goods and services that it purchases to run the government. Households pay money to the government in the form of net taxes. I say net taxes because the government also gives some money back to households in the form of welfare payments, unemployment insurance, medical payments, and so forth. But on net, households pay taxes into the government in the form of cash. In the other direction, the government supplies services to households in the form of schools and roads and bridges and national defense and other public goods. Over here on this side, we have the same story. Firms pay taxes to the government on net, although some firms get subsidies from the government. On net, however, the flow of money is from firms into the government in the form of taxes. The flow the other direction is the government providing goods and services to firms. Not only do firms use roads and bridges, but firms also profit from the court system and laws and contracts and such things that are enforced by the government. So national defense, security services, all of the things that are provided publicly flow back from the government in the form of resources, goods and services to the business sector. So we put the government here in the middle. Notice the government has a nice interaction and integration into this system with money and resources flowing as you might expect. We can also introduce one other player into the story, and that is the rest of the world. The rest of the world means people in other countries who want to buy and sell goods and services to people in the United States. That is, companies in the U.S. and private households buy goods from abroad, imports, and businesses here in the U.S. sell products, exports, to people in other countries. So as for the rest of the world, we notice that we have two ways of thinking about the interaction. We've got imports coming into our goods markets from abroad, and we've got goods going back out as exports. So the top arrow here represents the imports into the economy. The bottom resource arrow represents exports out. Money flows in the opposite direction. Whenever we import goods, we send money abroad to pay for it. And when we export goods, money comes back in. And there you have it, a complete circular flow diagram that shows how all of the players in the macroeconomy interact with one another. The main insight you get from studying this picture is that spending equals income. It's a closed system. It's like a set of plumbing pipes, and all the water sloshes around, but eventually there's only a certain amount of water in the whole system. And anytime you go to the store and you pay for something, when you're spending, money is going into the hands of a merchant to become his or her income. It's that simple. And in the aggregate, when you add up everything that people are spending and everything that people are receiving as income, the two numbers are necessarily always equal. Spending equals income. We'll be building on this concept throughout our study of macroeconomics. Here's a riddle. When is dishwashing not a productive activity? The answer is when your criterion for productivity is what shows up in the gross domestic product, and when you wash your dishes yourself. I just spent the last half hour washing my dishes, and it's as if the government statisticians don't even care. I do a lot of work at home, sweeping the floor, caring for children, caring for aged parents, and the government doesn't take any notice because it's not activity that's being transacted in markets. Therefore, it's not included in the gross domestic product. Now, 70% of all housework is done by women. Therefore, feminist economics, a growing branch of economics, seeks to bring about more accurate measures of the value created in the economy by including the value that's created in housework, the value created at home. Suppose I had someone come in and wash my dishes for me, and I had to pay them at market rates. Or I had someone come in and clean my house. What would this do to the gross domestic product if we imputed some kind of value to housework? Well, according to one economist, Robert Eisner, if you look at housework done in the United States in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and you value that housework at the market price of cleaning services, then housework probably would add about 20% to gross domestic product. That means about 1/5 of all of the value that's created in our economy isn't showing up in government statistics at all because it's not being transacted in markets. According to the United Nations Human Development Report, worldwide, probably about 40% of all value that's created in the world economy is created in housework, work being done at home, not measured in government statistics. Two economists, Kathleen Cloud and Nancy Garrett, estimate that if you impute market values to housework, that Guatemala's GDP would instantly increase by 75%, and Pakistan's by 80%, and the United States by almost 30%. Now, think about what this means. In the 1960s, only about 35 to 40% of the women in the United States had jobs outside their homes for which they received paychecks. In 1999, about 60% of all women are receiving paychecks for work in the market. So by how much has gross domestic product increased because of this change in labor force participation by women? Well, women are, say for example, software engineers. A woman who has a job now creating software is getting a paycheck because of the value added by her work. And yet, if she was working at home previously, caring for children and cleaning dishes, this work is now being done by someone else, say a cleaning service that's receiving a check. Now, hold on, there's a double counting here because that cleaning service is now in the gross domestic product because it's a market transaction, whereas her cleaning before wasn't showing up. Therefore, the change in gross domestic product is overstated because work which she was previously doing is now showing up in GDP because it's being done by someone else who's paid. If you take this into account, according to some measures, that Norway's gross domestic product has been way overstated. That is, the growth in GDP may have been overstated by as much as 20% because of this double counting. It's also difficult to measure the way in which the quality of this work may have changed. I mean, after all, who would you rather have at home taking care of the house, the person who lives there, or someone who comes in from outside who may not do as good a job? Changes in quality wouldn't show up at all. Now, how do we make this situation better? How do we get measures of the value created in our economy that put the proper weight on housework? Well, this is the agenda of feminist economics, accurate measures of value. If, for example, we impute value to housework based on what you'd have to pay someone to come in and do it, that's a first step. We already do that in the national income accounts by imputing the value of the service you get by living in your house. We impute that at an approximate rental rate, and that helps us to have an accurate measure of how much value people get from all of the homes that are in the economy that aren't being traded on the market right now. So why hasn't this change already occurred? And the answer is that before now there hasn't really been a constituency. People have been pleased or basically pleased with the way gross domestic product has been measured. But because feminist economics has raised our awareness of the way in which gross domestic product doesn't accurately measure value that's created, we've started thinking about ways of doing that more. So as the constituency arises for change in the way we keep our records, we're more likely to change the way we keep our records. And that suits me fine, because I know that my housework is valuable. I just assume that the government recognized that and showed me in total how much value is being created by the work that we do at home as well as the work that we do in the market.
Hi. I'm just in the neighborhood, and I have a lawn mowing service, and I was just wondering if you would like your lawn mowed.
Oh, well, I usually mow my own lawn, thanks.
Well, it looks, you know, kind of tall out there, so I just thought...
Well, I've been kind of busy this week. I haven't really gotten to it yet, but...
You know, it's only $35, and I'm going to school right now, and I could really use it for my chemistry books, and...
$35? You know, I think maybe I'd pay $15 to do it.
These are really expensive books.
Oh.
$25?
Is that your lawnmower?
Yeah.
You really use that thing?
Yeah. Oh, it works. I mean, it's guaranteed to cut lawns.
$20.
$20? Cool. $20.
Great. I gotta see this. Given how much I hate to mow my lawn, I think I just got a good deal. But I feel a little bit guilty. I mean, is she going to report that income to the Internal Revenue Service and pay taxes on it? Most likely, she's a participant in what economists call the underground economy. The term underground economy refers to any economic activity that takes place outside of government supervision. And usually this activity is undertaken by its participants to avoid the law or to avoid paying taxes. One example of an underground economy are the activities that surround illegal trade, traffic in narcotics, or people who drive illegal immigrants across international boundaries. Another set of underground transactions are those undertaken expressly to avoid paying taxes. So when people get paid in cash, like she is, chances are she's not going to report that income to the government. And if she doesn't, she's part of the underground economy. Another example of underground economic transaction is barter. If my neighbor comes over and rakes my leaves and I go over and paint his living room, our trade involves value for both of us. But if we don't report this value to the Internal Revenue Service and pay tax on this in-kind income, then we're avoiding taxes and are part of the underground economy. Now, is this something that we should be worried about? The underground economy may account for a relatively large chunk of the economic output of the United States. Some economists estimate that somewhere between 3% and 20% of gross domestic product comes from this kind of underground transactions. In the United States, this is even a relatively small amount of our economy. A country like Italy, we might be talking about upwards of 1/3 of GDP coming from underground activities. So, is it a problem? Well, first of all, anytime a transaction like this occurs, taxes are being avoided. Consider then that in 1992, the Internal Revenue Service estimated that about $100 billion worth of tax revenue was lost because people didn't pay taxes on activities like this one. By 1998, the amount lost in taxes was estimated to be as high as $200 billion, and that amount will probably increase as the underground economy grows. So not only is tax revenue lost, but also there are resources tied up in the enforcement of tax laws, and the more people turn to underground activities, the harder police and the taxmen have to work to make sure that we get the money to fund government programs and pay for public goods like streets and street lights and schools and so forth. So as people avoid their taxes, there's less revenue to provide the goods and services that government provides for us. Then there's all of the wasteful activity that people do to try to avoid the police, like hiding their lawnmowers and doing this activity after dark and so forth. Next thing you know, however, she's going to need protection for her property rights, or someone's going to find out that she's doing this activity on the sly and threaten to blackmail her and turn her in. Then we've got organized crime surrounding this activity. People who are tough, people who are strong, forming kind of their own law around underground activities, as happened around alcohol in the U.S. around the turn of the last century, and as happens around narcotics today. So we get that kind of stuff. In the end, there's a lot of waste that surrounds underground economic activity. On the other hand, there's a lot of innovation that surrounds it as well. People who don't yet have the resources to go and apply for a license and deal with all the government regulation can start their own simple job by getting a lawnmower and going out and mowing lawns for people. Of course, they are putting themselves in a position of risk and liability, but at the same time, they are making a living. And she's probably going to be discovering some new things about mowing lawns that she can share with other people. Innovation is likely to occur as well. So, while the underground economic activity may create greater dispersion of wealth, meaning that some people pay taxes and other people don't, this kind of activity can also level the playing field by giving anybody a chance to get in and try to make their way. So what can we do about the underground economy? If we're concerned that, in fact, we're losing too much money in taxes, we really have two alternatives. One is to increase enforcement and go after people like her and her lawn business and make them pay their taxes. That involves a big expenditure of resources. The second thing is simply to legalize activities and bring them under the auspices of the government so that they can be taxed more thoroughly, as happened with alcohol around the turn of the last century. Now, legalization isn't going to change her lawn business. Maybe we should have more enforcement to make people like her pay taxes. On the other hand, if she weren't here, I'd have to mow the lawn myself. So you see, I'm in a quandary. The underground economy has costs for society, but it also has benefits.